Hello. In this presentation, I will talk about the basics of how to write a philosophy essay. First of all, let's talk about what a philosophy essay is and what differentiates it from other kind of papers, essays. A philosophy essay is argumentative, first of all, and that is the most important thing here. It is not a mere report of your opinions or opinions of other philosophers. You are not just summarizing what people say, right? What other philosophers say, or you don't just say, okay, I think this is the case, or here's my opinion, or I disagree. You don't just say that and leave it at that. Your aim is to convince the reader that your thesis statement is true. So you should defend your claims and offer reasons to believe them. You are not just laying out your opinions, or you are not just summarizing other philosophers' opinions. There must be something that you are trying to convince the reader of. Okay, so you have a claim, you must have a claim, and then the paper, the essay, is actually your defense of that claim. Okay, and that claim we call the thesis statement. In that sense, it is argumentative. Okay, so what is an argument? All arguments can be rephrased with the word therefore. So then an argument will be something like, this is the case, therefore this other thing is also the case, right? And the statement that comes after therefore, which we call the conclusion, is what you are trying to convince people of. So an argument is composed of premise or premises, right? More than one premise, at least one, and the conclusion. Premises purport to give us good reason to believe that the conclusion is true. So premises are the statements that you use to support the conclusion. Example. This is an argument. Protagoras claims that man is the measure of all things, right? This famous statement, relativistic. Protagoras claims that man is the measure of all things. Protagoras is a man. Therefore, Protagoras is the measure of all things. So this argument has two premises. And the conclusion is Protagoras is the measure of all things. This is an argument. There is therefore, there is an inference, right? If there is an inference, that means there is an argument. You can use other words instead of therefore. You can say thus, hence, so, things like that. Or you can put because before the premises. You can, right? Protagoras is the measure of all things. Because Protagoras claims that man is the measure of all things, and Protagoras is a man. Something like that. But this is not a good argument. Right? This is an argument, but it is not a good argument. Because, think about it, the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Yes, Protagoras is a man, and he says that man is the measure of all things. But from that, it doesn't follow that he is the measure of all things. Because the first premise says Protagoras claims that man is the measure of all things. That doesn't mean that he is right about that. Right? So the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, actually. So when you are offering arguments, this is one thing you should be very careful about. Your conclusion must follow from the premises. In this example, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, right? When you are criticizing an argument, again, if that is the problem, then you should be very specific about it. You should explicitly say that. When you are criticizing an argument, when you are objecting to an argument, you should specify what the problem is if you don't agree with the argument. And one way an argument can be a bad argument is that the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Or, look at this. If that penalty has a deterrent effect, then that penalty should be legal. That penalty has a deterrent effect. Therefore, that penalty should be legal. The conclusion follows from the premises. If both of the premises were true or are true, then the conclusion cannot be false, right? So the conclusion follows from the premises, but you can still object to this argument. And you can say, well, yes, the conclusion follows, but one of the premises, at least one of the premises, is false. You can say that penalty has no deterrent effect. Based on research, based on scientific studies, you can say something like that if you back it up. Or you can say the first premise is false. If that penalty has a deterrent effect, then that penalty should be legal. No, it doesn't follow. There can be other reasons why it shouldn't be legal, even if it is deterrent. So if the conclusion follows from the premises, we call that argument a valid argument. If the conclusion does not follow from the premises, we call it invalid. And maybe the conclusion does follow from the premises, so it is valid, but one of the premises, or at least one of the premises, is false. Then we call that argument unsound. If it is invalid, it is also unsound. So we want sound arguments. We want arguments that have true premises and the conclusion follows from the premises. Okay, I won't be talking about critical thinking and logic that much in this presentation. This will be more about writing and philosophy essay, but we should be able to distinguish bad arguments from good arguments in order to write a philosophy essay, because argument is the central thing here. So when you are giving your arguments in order to defend your thesis statement, you should be very careful. Your conclusion should follow from the premises, and your premises should be true. Then, which means in your essay you should defend the premises, because you are trying to convince the reader that your thesis statement is true. So then you should convince the reader that your premises are true. Okay. So what can you do in a philosophy essay? What kind of things? Let's take this statement. The morally right action is the one that maximizes general happiness. Okay, utilitarianism. The moral right action is the one that maximizes general happiness. What can you do about this? First of all, this can be your thesis statement, and you can offer reasons to believe that this claim is true. That's one thing you can do, right? The truth of this statement is what you are trying to convince the reader of. That can be the case. Or you can object to this. You can offer reasons to believe that this claim is false. You can say, Mill says, let's say, that the moral right action is the one that maximizes general happiness, but he is wrong about this. Now, this is your thesis statement. The falsity of this claim is your thesis statement. Can be, right? That's another thing you can do. Or you can show that certain arguments for the claim are not good. So, for example, in this case, you are not saying that this statement is false, but what you are saying is, let's say, Mill has an argument to support this claim, but his argument is not a good argument, and this is your thesis statement now. You are trying to convince the reader that Mill's argument for this statement is not good. If you are doing that, then you should specify why it is not good. Is it invalid? Does the conclusion doesn't follow the premises? Or the premises are false? Or at least one of them are false? Maybe both. It is both invalid and not, and it doesn't have true premises. Whatever it is, you should specify. But that is another thing you can do. Maybe you can object to arguments for a claim, rather than just saying that, rather than trying to convince the reader that the claim itself is false. They are different things. If an argument is a bad argument, that means it doesn't give us good reason to believe that the conclusion is true. But that doesn't mean necessarily that the conclusion is false, because maybe that argument that you are evaluating is bad, but that doesn't mean that there are no other good arguments for that conclusion. Okay, you should be very clear about what you are doing. You can defend an argument or a claim against someone else's criticism. Maybe, so Mill has an argument in order to support this statement, and from the literature you find some objections to his argument, and in your essay you can actually defend Mill against those objections in the literature. Right? There's another thing you can do. You can contrast the strengths and weaknesses of two opposing views, so you can compare and evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of this utilitarian position with Kantian position, for example. There is another thing you can do. You can revise a claim in the light of some objection. For example, the objection that sometimes this statement actually, or utilitarian approach, might condone injustices like slavery, right? If it maximizes general happiness or something like that. And then you can say, okay, this is a good objection, but it doesn't mean that we should just get rid of the whole, utilitarian approach. Maybe we can revise this, and maybe we can say the moral right action is the one that maximizes general happiness unless it causes injustice. And then you should, of course, tell about what you understand from injustice. So you can revise the position. But that might be something that you can do in your essay. So there are things like this. You can think of other things if it is up to you, if your instructor doesn't specify the essay question. These are the things that you can do in a philosophy essay. As you can see, it is argumentative. You are trying to convince the reader that what you are saying is true. The thesis statement is your claim. right? So let's see. In this essay, I will compare and contrast Kantian ethics with utilitarian ethics. This is not a good thesis statement. This is not a thesis statement at all, actually. So you are talking about what you are going to do, right? In the introduction, you should have your thesis statement. And this statement, this sentence here, does say what you will be doing in this essay. But it is not helpful. It's too general. Your thesis statement should specify your thesis, your claim. The reader, when the reader reads your introductory paragraph, the reader should have a very good idea about what it is that you are trying to convince the reader of. Now it is not clear here. What are you going to say? Not clear. It shouldn't be mysterious, right? So how about this? In this essay, I argue that Kantian ethics is preferable to utilitarian ethics since utilitarian ethics potentially condones certain unacceptable injustices, such as slavery. Well, now this gives an idea to the reader. Now this gives an idea. Now I know, when I look at this, now I know what your position will be, what you are trying to convince me of, you know, what you are trying to persuade, and your approach. You will be saying that there are some injustices that are unacceptable, and slavery is one of them, and utilitarian perspective sometimes condones these things, and that is why it is not you know, acceptable. But Kantian ethics doesn't have this problem, so it is more preferable. You see, you give the whole thing without the details, of course. All right. So you need to convince your reader that you are right in this essay. That is the main thing you are trying to do. Who is your reader, though? Not the teacher, not the instructor. You shouldn't think that way. Your audience, imagine your audience is someone who is interested in philosophy, but who is not familiar with the particular details of the topic that you are talking about. So imagine a friend, for example, who is not taking the course that you are taking. Right? So you are writing this philosophy essay for a course. Imagine that friend is smart, you know, in general, but not very knowledgeable about the particular content of this course that you are writing this essay for. Imagine you are writing for that friend, which means it should be very clear what you are writing. If the teacher can only understand what you are writing in your essay because he or she is the teacher, that is not good enough. A person shouldn't have to be the teacher in order to understand what you are writing. Anyone should be able to understand what you are writing. For that, you should explicitly and clearly present reasons for the claims you make. Clearly and explicitly. And you need to explain your topic briefly, probably, and explain any technical words that you use. Because again, they are not the reader, you are imagining the reader is not familiar with the particular terminology or the content of the course that you are taking. Plus, I would recommend you also imagine the reader is not someone that you are getting along very well, right? And this reader tries to misunderstand you actually, right? So doesn't try to understand you what you are saying and very quick to judge, that kind of a person. So you should not give the person the opportunity to misunderstand you. That should be your standard for clarity. Even if a person doesn't care, doesn't try to understand me and prone to misunderstand me, I shouldn't give them the opportunity to do that. I should be so clear that even if they are very sloppy when they are reading, they shouldn't be able to misunderstand me. Okay, clarity is very, very important. Alright, so this is a very common mistake. I mean, reading order and writing order are different in philosophy essays. Reading order, what is the reading order? Where do you start reading? From the first sentence and then you end with the last sentence, right? Well, writing order is not like that. Actually, you shouldn't start with the first sentence. You should first write the body paragraphs, and then the introduction and the conclusion comes. Because if you start with the introduction and you say, okay, this is what I will be doing in the essay, but maybe your views will change while you are writing, right? So you don't start with writing either. right? You don't start with the first sentence, plus you don't start with writing. So imagine this. So something like this. So this is a bridge, right? So how do we build bridges? Do we build bridges, construct the bridges with starting from one side and then we end up in the other side by you know, step by step from the left hand side and in the right hand side? No, we do something like this, right? The suspensions. First you have the framework, the scaffold, right, the suspensions, and then based on that you are building the rest of the bridge. You need that before you actually build the road, right? You need the suspensions, the framework, the scaffolding. So that is actually the outline of the essay. Before you start building the, you know, the main part, you need a framework. So in the early stages of writing, you don't just start writing the essay, actually. You start work early and you think, try to form your own view, and your view is important, of course, in a philosophy essay, your evaluation, your arguments, and the way you defend them. So you need to form your own views about these. You should, and that requires time and, you know, mental effort. You should write your ideas down. Just note them down. Maybe not very systematically. It can be chaotic. Just what you are thinking. Different ideas. Just try different ideas. Just take notes, right? And then you can systematize them and make an outline. Maybe bullet point, right? I will first say this and then this. I will give this argument and maybe this possible objection to my argument in order to convince the reader that I'm right. That kind of a thing, right? And actually your outline can change in time when you are thinking. Maybe based on that outline you start writing, and while you are writing you think of something else, a new thing. You can change your outline, you can revise the outline. But you see, this is like the suspension. You need an outline, you need a plan. You cannot just sit down at the table and start writing. You need a plan, you need a roadmap. That is why you should start early. And while you are writing based on this outline, which is, again, as I said, is tentative, but while you are writing, you should use, as a general rule, simple prose, right? Short sentences are fine. Do not try to produce a literary, you know, masterpiece or anything. For you, in an undergrad philosophy course, what is important is clarity. And as a general rule, again, there can be exceptions, but as a general rule, simple short sentences are easier to understand in general, especially if English is not your first language. Be concise, but explain yourself fully. So your essay shouldn't need further explanation. Sometimes I give feedback to students and I say, look, this is not clear what you are saying here. And then the student says, no, so here's what I meant. Well, if you need to explain what you mean, then it is not good, right? You cannot be there with the reader when the reader is, you know, working on your essay to explain. It should be self-contained. It should be self-sufficient. To that end, you can use examples and definitions when they are necessary in order to make it clear what you are talking about. And of course, while you are writing, you should anticipate objections and respond to them. This is part of the standard structure of a philosophy essay. You are trying to convince the reader that your thesis statement is true. While you are presenting arguments for that, you should also anticipate possible objections from the reader. What could they say against what I am saying? And then you will say, okay, here is a possible objection. And you will respond and you will defend your thesis statement or your argument against those possible objections. And don't think that you just start again. So this is a mistake. Your work on this essay does not start with the first sentence and does not end with the last sentence. You start working on the essay before you start writing the actual essay, and you keep working on the essay after you finish writing the essay. Okay, so you should go back and read it one more time at least, see the maybe English and grammar mistakes and things like that, and maybe you will notice some better examples that than the ones that you have given. You can think of a new objection or something like that, or you realize that your reply to one of the objections is not good enough and you can think of something better, whatever, right? So don't think that you just put the last, word there and then you are done. No, you should go back. This takes time. So that is why it is a very, very bad idea to do it at the last minute. You see, this is a long process. It doesn't have to be very time consuming, by the way. This is about time management. So if you say, for example, for every day, like half an hour or something like that, you can allocate for this, it would be, you will see the end product will be much, much, much better than just squeezing it in the last night before the deadline. You will, of course, present the views of others. Again, I want to emphasize that your views are the important ones in general in a philosophy essay, but of course you will present other views too. And it is better to paraphrase them rather than direct quotes, because this shows that you understand what you cite. You should only quote or summarize the parts that are relevant to your essay. Sometimes what students do is maybe one sentence is relevant to what they are trying to say, and then they quote the whole paragraph. You shouldn't do that. That gives the impression that you don't even realize that those parts are not relevant, or you don't care about the reader because you are just throwing themselves some unnecessary, irrelevant parts. Right? So you should be careful about that. You should only quote or summarize the very specific, very important, relevant parts from other people's work. Of course, you shouldn't overdo it. You shouldn't have too many quotations and paraphrases and things like that. Again, what you are thinking and how you support your views, that is important, or your evaluation of the views that you are talking about. And you should cite, put the information about the source when necessary. So when is it necessary? Well, in order to avoid plagiarism, that's one important thing. Be careful. You shouldn't take credit for someone else's work. Okay, so as a general rule, you shouldn't take credit from someone else's work. You can, of course, use someone else's work, but you should cite. And in order to avoid speculation too, you should use citation. Remember the example we gave for an argument. We said maybe death penalty has a deterrent effect. You are saying that, and you want to defend that argument. Then you shouldn't just say, okay, the death penalty has a deterrent effect. You should cite scientific and research about this, scientific studies about this, sociological, psychological, whatever. Because otherwise it would be speculation, right? When empirical data is relevant, then you should cite it. Or you are saying Aristotle says this, and it is not obvious, it's not just common knowledge, for example, then you should cite. In order to help the reader, maybe they want to look at the source themselves in order to see whether they will agree with your interpretation or not, right? This is about helping the reader. Clarity is, again, very, very important. You need to use terminology correctly. If you confuse the terminology, then it will affect clarity a lot negatively. So, for example, argument is one thing, claim is another thing. Argument is the inference. It is composed of premises and the conclusion. Claim is, well, each of the premises is a claim and the conclusion is a claim. They are statements. Statements can be true or false. The premises can be true or false. The conclusion can be true or false. An argument cannot be true or false. An argument is a good argument or a bad argument, sound or unsound. So if you confuse these terms, then the reader will not understand what you mean. For example, man is the measure of all things. Sometimes students say, Protagoras says man is the measure of all things. I don't agree with this argument. Well, what argument? What argument are we talking about? That is not an argument. Man is the measure of all things is a claim. It's a statement. It is not an argument. When the student confuses argument and claim and says, okay, I don't agree with this argument, then the reader thinks, okay, what argument is this student talking about? Protagoras' specific argument for this, that the student doesn't mention that argument, but Is the student talking about an argument that the reader is supposed to know or something? Or is this just a misuse of these words? Right? So creates a lot of confusion. Please be careful about that. Also, when you are presenting a view, it should be clear to the reader whether you are presenting someone else's view, like you are reporting someone else's view, or is it your view, or you are presenting a view and you agree with it, right? So sometimes students just say, for example, let's say writing an essay about Hobbes, and the student says, well, selfishness is in human nature. Now, sometimes it is not at all clear whether the student says this in the sense that this is what Hobbes says, or is it like what the student says. Okay, so whose view, it should be very clear. You can just say according to Hobbes, in my opinion, or something like that, right? You can say these things. You should, Hobbes says this and I agree, that kind of a thing. It should be clear whose view it is that you are talking about. Are you presenting someone else's view? Are you putting your view? Also, sometimes students talk about in a paragraph or at the earlier parts of the essay, multiple views, multiple claims, multiple arguments, and then the student says, well, but I don't agree with this claim, or I don't agree with this argument. Even if they use the term correctly, sometimes it is not clear which claim they are talking about, because there have been more than one, right? So which argument, which claim you are talking about, you should be very specific about that. Again, you shouldn't give the opportunity to misunderstand you to the reader. Everything should be clear. Do not postpone clarity. Sometimes this happens. The student says something, there's a statement, it is not clear what the student is talking about, but then step by step the student reveals what that means, and it becomes more and more clear. Well, as a literary device, well, that can be interesting, but in a philosophy essay, you shouldn't postpone clarity. At every point, the reader should be clear about what they are reading. Right, what it means. Every point it should be clear. You shouldn't postpone clarity. In order to do that, give clear definitions when necessary, and sometimes some terms are used in philosophy in a different meaning than they are used in daily language. So you should specify, in order to clarify it, you should specify in what meaning you are using these terms. Sometimes you can use these terms, sometimes these terms can have multiple meanings, even in the philosophical context. You should still specify, I am using this term in this meaning in this essay, right? You can say that. Here's what I mean by this term. So, for example, you are writing about happiness, whether happiness is the only intrinsically valuable thing or not, let's say. You can say, in this essay, I am using this term happiness in this sense. You can say that because there are many different, definitions of happiness. People understand different things from happiness. So you are saying, this is the way I'm using this. You can say that. This is very helpful for clarity. You should use connective words in general, because this makes clear the connection between ideas, right? The connection between the statements. Again, this is helping the reader understand the relation between what you are saying. You should tell the reader what you have done so far and what you are going to do next. In general, you should always help the reader navigate in your essay. At no point should the reader ask himself or herself, okay, why am I reading this part now? How is this related to other things? Where will this be tied to, right? The reader shouldn't stop and think about these things. It should be always clear why the reader is reading what they are reading. Okay, it should be always clear. So you can say things like, I will begin by doing this, right? Before I say what is wrong with this argument, so for example, you presented the argument, before I say what is wrong with this argument, I want to first maybe clarify this term or something like that, right? You see, you are helping the reader navigate. These passages suggest that. So you quoted something, you have a quote, and then you say this suggests. Now the reader knows that you are interpreting what you have quoted, right? So you don't just start talking. You don't assume that the reader will read your mind. Don't shy away from using these things, helping the reader navigate. I will now defend the claim. Don't just start defending the, say, I will now defend the claim, or something like that. Further support for this claim comes from, now the reader knows, okay, you didn't move on to another topic now, another argument, you are now giving another support, right? A further support. And you don't start giving an example and you say, for example, and here's an example in support of this view or this first premise or something like that. These things we call signposting, right? Signposting, right? Like the road on the road, like the signs on the road that say, here you are going this way, this intersection is coming, or you are leaving Şerefli Koçhisar or whatever, right? That kind of thing. You are helping the reader navigate through your essay. The reader should never ever feel lost. Okay, where are we now in the structure of this essay? They shouldn't ask this question. You shouldn't let them ask this question. Again, these things you can use. You can copy and paste these things, by the way. You can just use these because that wouldn't be plagiarism. These are just phrases that are used to signpost. The content, of course, comes from you. Things like this. We have just seen how X says that B, how Socrates says that unexamined life is not worth living or whatever. I will now present two arguments against this view. Okay, you see, now the reader is more clear. My first argument is, and then you give the argument. X, right, might respond to my argument in several ways. For instance, he or she could say that, right? So you had an argument against Socrates, and now you are saying, but Socrates might respond to my argument in several ways. For instance, okay, now the reader knows what you are doing. And then, however, this response fails because, right? Another way that X might respond to my argument is by claiming that this response also fails because my second argument is, you see how these are helpful? These are very, very helpful, right? Use these things. Now the organization, of course, there's introduction, body, and conclusion. In the introduction, there are some things that you should do. First of all, you should have a very clear thesis statement in the way that we talked about. And you should also summarize the general plan. So what will be your strategy to defend the thesis statement? So, for example, I will give counterexamples to this claim that I am arguing against, and then I will consider Mill's argument against my thesis statement or something like that, right? Just the general plan. If necessary, you can also say something about the importance of your thesis statement. So why should the reader care about your thesis? Why is it important? You can say something about that too. You can contextualize it. That's another thing you can do in the introduction. In the body of the essay, you should defend your thesis and give replies to possible objections, as we said. Now, students tend to think in terms of body paragraphs. So how many paragraphs should I have? In this body, I will do this. In that body, I will do this. In general, for philosophers, that is not important. That is just stylistic. That is just cosmetics. The important thing is it should be easy to read. So as a general rule, longer paragraphs are more difficult to read. So shorter paragraphs in general are better. Of course, there can be exceptions. I see students obsessed with the number of paragraphs. Who cares? Not important. The important thing is a clarity. Sometimes maybe if your arguments are short, then you can have the argument and then a possible objection to the argument and your defense in just one paragraph. Maybe sometimes you need to, separate them. It doesn't matter. It should be readable. It should be clear. The structure should be clear. And signposting is very important here, very helpful here. That is not an important thing. How many paragraphs we are talking about is not in general, unless your instructor gives you very specific instructions. In general, that is not an important thing. It's up to you. And the conclusion must include summary of the most important points, the highlights. What you want the reader to be left with, right? You are specifying those things in the conclusion. Let's talk about some common mistakes that students do when they are writing philosophy essays. So your thesis shouldn't be, of course, just historical, psychological, or sociological. It should be a philosophical thesis. You shouldn't use unsupported empirical claims, as I said before. If you are making an empirical claim, you should support it. You shouldn't speculate. Try to avoid overstatements. If you say, this is obvious, or everyone agrees with this, or human nature is like this, right? It's maybe obvious for you, but not for everyone. So we try to avoid overstatement and generalizations. When you are making generalizations, think twice whether it is the case or not. Be careful about your hidden assumptions. Again, if you are saying something is obvious, maybe it is not obvious for everyone. You can make, of course, assumptions, but you should explicitly say, assuming this, I will continue. Right? Be careful about that. Ask yourself, can the reader disagree about this with me? Sometimes maybe so you are talking about human nature, for example, right? You are talking about Hobbes and human nature, and you are saying that human nature is not only selfish, but human nature also involves some altruistic aspects, or something like that. I don't know. Of course, the reader can question the very existence of human nature. Then you can say something like this. Well, the reader might question the existence of human nature in the first place, but in this essay, I will assume that human nature exists, and then I will evaluate Hobbes's arguments based on the existence of human nature. So you can say this, because if you try to first establish the existence of human nature, it might be too much work for this essay, right? Maybe it is impossible for you to actually do a good job and really focus on the existence of human nature in the first place. So you make your thesis statement conditional, and you say, I will be writing this essay with the assumption that there is human nature. If there is a human nature, then here is my thesis statement, right? You can do that. But if you just assume that the human nature exists without explicitly saying that, then of course this will alienate the reader, and if the reader asks, okay, why should I read this? I don't believe that there's human nature, so the whole essay will be irrelevant to them. So if you have some assumptions, you can just make them explicit, and you can just say, I don't have the room to prove you that this is true in this essay. I will assume that it is true. You can do that. That is fine in general. Because the reader shouldn't agree. You are not saying that you should agree that there is human nature. You should agree that my assumption is true. This is an assumption. It will be conditional. If my assumption is true, then this will be the case. That can also be a valuable contribution. And you should avoid redundancy and repetition in general. So this is a very good rule to keep in mind. If deleting a sentence will not have a negative effect on your essay, then keeping it does have a negative effect on your essay, right? Just ask this for every statement you've written, or maybe word even, right? Every quote, every example you give. If deleting it will not have a negative effect, if deleting it will not make your essay less understandable, then you should delete it actually, right? Keeping something that is redundant is a problem. It does affect the readability of your essay. Okay, this is I think a very good rule in general. Of course, again, as I said, your work doesn't end with the last sentence you write. You should go back and read it again. I see that a lot actually. I can tell the student just started from the first sentence and it finished with the last sentence and never looked back. Never read the whole thing again. Filled with English errors, grammar errors, typos. This gives the instructor the impression that the student doesn't care, right? Don't give that impression to your instructor. There are avoidable mistakes, so you should you should read it again. You should be careful about that too. It's, of course, the content is important in a philosophy essay, but, well, your presentation of the content is not totally unimportant. Sometimes English mistakes and grammar mistakes can affect clarity. Because of those mistakes, sometimes it is not clear what the student is talking about. So you should be careful about English and grammar too. Whenever you use conclusion indicators like therefore, thus, hence, so, that's why, things like that, you should be very careful. When the instructor, a philosophy instructor, reads your essay, and if the instructor sees these words, therefore, hence, things like that, then the alarms go off in their head. But because then the instructor says, oh, okay, there's an argument here. Let's see if it is valid. Let's see if it is sound. Let's see if the conclusion follows from the premises. What are the premises? Are they true? Are they sufficiently supported by the student? So if you are not giving an argument, do not use conclusion indicators. Do not use therefore, hence, thus, if you are not giving an argument. In general, again, as a general rule. Students tend to avoid the use of the word I. I think because in English composition classes, some English instructors tell them to avoid using the word I. That is not at all the case in a philosophy essay. You should. I'm not just saying you can use the word I. I'm saying you should, in general, as a general rule. Because in a philosophy essay, you are at the center. It is your view. It is your defense of some other person's view. It is your evaluation of some other person's view, or just your original argument, right? It is you at the center. Your opinions, your evaluations are at the center. In philosophy, we use this all the time. You can say, in my opinion, Socrates was wrong. And here is why. Of course, you don't just say, this is my opinion and move on. No. You say, this is my opinion, I believe this, I disagree with this, whatever. And then, why? Of course, you will give reasons for that. But you can, and again, as a general rule, you should use the word I in a philosophy paper. And one way of avoiding the use of this word I, students tend to use passive voice in general. And passive voice is not a good thing. You don't have to do that. You say, I will do this, this, this. So far, I have defended my argument. Now, I will talk about an objection that maybe Socrates can give to my argument, or something like that. No, not passive voice. Passive voice, in general, makes it more difficult, more convoluted, actually, your writing. You can use active voice. Again, we said shorter sentences in general are better, so passive voice doesn't help with that, actually. All right. So let me give you some examples. Again, do not use too long sentences or paragraphs. Here's an example. How about this? There is an argument given by Aristotle in order to defend the idea that pleasure is not the chief good. Is there anything wrong with this? English-wise, it sounds okay, grammar-wise. There is an argument given by Aristotle in order to defend the idea that pleasure is not the chief good. Can we make this more reader friendly? How about this? Aristotle gives an argument to defend the idea that pleasure is not the chief good. Instead of saying that there is an argument given by Aristotle, can't we say that Aristotle gives an argument? Isn't this better? This is now active voice. How about this? Aristotle argues that pleasure is not the chief good. This is good enough. You don't have to, pour words into your sentences. The more convoluted, the worse it is for the reader. Keep it simple. This is what you are trying to say. Then just say it. Right? As I said, if deleting something, taking something out doesn't affect negatively, then you should take it out, actually. All right, just do this. It's much easier for the reader. All right. And lastly, There can be specific instructions by your teacher. Maybe there's a specific essay question, there's an essay prompt. Be careful that you answer all the parts of the question, right? Not just one part. If there are multiple parts to the prompt, there are multiple things that you are supposed to be doing, then make sure that you are doing everything in the essay. Word limit, format, citation style, if there are specific instructions, please keep them in mind. That's also important. All right, thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. This is not very comprehensive actually. There are other things you can learn about how to write a philosophy essay, but one thing is you will learn better once you practice, right? So these were the basics of how to write a philosophy essay. I hope it was helpful. Thank you.